as John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, John Calhoun of South Carolina, and Henry Clay of Kentucky jockeyed for position in the 1824 presidential race, Jackson backed efforts by his supporters to further his own candidacy. When the electoral votes were counted, Jackson led the field with 99 votes. But since no candidate had a majority of electoral votes, the election would have to be decided in the House of Representatives. Henry Clay of Kentucky was Speaker. Now out of the running, he struck a deal with Adams. Though not one of Kentucky's electors had voted for Adams, Clay would deliver Kentucky's electoral votes to Adams if Adams would name Clay as his Secretary of State. When Adams won on the House's first ballot, Jackson's supporters cried foul. To them and to millions of citizens, the so-called corrupt bargain was proof that the federal government was being run for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many.
It's not clear today that there was precisely the kind of deal that Jackson and the so-called friends of Jackson, his political supporters, called the corrupt bargain. That is, some people would ask today, what else could Clay have done? And given who the other candidates were, and given Clay's relationship to Crawford or Clay's relationship to Jackson, I don't think he needed a promise of the position of Secretary of State in order to do what he did, and he was in some ways a logical candidate for that position. But the Jackson people made it seem like a bargain, a selling out of the people's feelings.
The election of 1828 was one of the nastiest presidential races in American history. With a campaign slogan of Jackson and Reform, Jackson vowed that if elected, he would eliminate the national debt and end corruption. The struggle was couched in terms of the people versus the special interests. With the Hunters of Kentucky as his campaign song, Jackson was presented as a revolutionary veteran whose heart still beat with the pure virtues of the old Republican ideals. The scar on Jackson's forehead from a British saber was a badge of honor. But having made the election a referendum on virtue, Jackson's opponents did everything they could to defile his integrity. His fights, his duels, cockfighting, horse racing, his high-handed actions in Florida, his questionable marriage to Rachel, a woman who was technically already married, were all cataloged and exaggerated for effect. Unfounded charges and countercharges flew. John Quincy Adams' surprising success as an envoy to Russia was explained with the fantastic story that he had given the Tsar an American girl as a sex slave in return for a diplomatic agreement. Jackson's mother was falsely depicted as a common prostitute brought to America by British soldiers. His father, a part black mulatto. Rachel Jackson was treated to special abuse by the adversarial press. But despite the vicious slanders, Jackson emerged as the clear favorite with 56% of the popular vote. The common people of America had spoken clearly. They considered Old Hickory to be one of their own. But tensions had now increased between Jackson and his vice president, Calhoun. Jackson was deeply disturbed by noises coming out of the South, complaining that the federal government consistently favored the interests of northern manufacturers over those of southern planters. Southern political theorists developed a doctrine called nullification, and the chief of the nullifiers was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Calhoun and his followers argued that each state could decide for itself if a federal law applied. They claimed a constitutional right for states to veto federal legislation, and if its wishes were ignored, a state had the right to withdraw from the Union. The nullifiers and the government collided over two issues: removal of the Cherokee people from Georgia and the tariff. The Cherokee had created their own well-regulated sovereign state. They believed they were protected by treaty with the United States. But the state of Georgia refused to recognize Cherokee sovereignty or federal authority for the treaties and challenged Cherokee ownership of the land. The Cherokee appealed to the Supreme Court, which ruled in its favor. But Georgia refused to recognize the Marshall Court's authority. When asked to enforce the ruling, President Jackson, the ex-Indian fighter, reportedly said,
"John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it."
Though Jackson would not enforce the ruling, neither would he recognize the legitimacy of Georgia's claim. As a way out of the impasse, Jackson pushed for the voluntary removal of all native peoples from the Southeast to lands west of the Mississippi. During his presidency, he signed over 90 treaties with various tribes, promising them western lands and eternal sovereignty if they would only leave their homes. But there was a fist of steel inside Jackson's velvet glove. Those tribes that resisted were driven out by the United States Army. Most Americans found the policy rational and humane, and praised Jackson for so skillfully dealing with the so-called Indian question.
And I think he looked back to 200 years of history, saying that Indians had been basically exterminated for 200 years when they came into conflict with whites. And his practical solution was two things. Either Indians could individually choose to accept a piece of land and adopt white ways and become farmers, or if they wished to maintain their culture, they could be moved further west. And those were the conditions of most of his treaties. They were the conditions that became the basis of his Indian removal policy when he became president. So I think that while I don't think we would condone his actions given what we know about what happened afterwards, I think his intentions were probably more sympathetic to Native Americans than we generally credit him with.
Far more troubling to most Americans were the South Carolina nullifiers, who swore that they would resist by force rather than submit to what they called the Tariff of Abominations, which drastically raised duties on many goods the South imported from overseas. As their righteous rhetoric swelled, the Southerners claimed to be willing to die in defense of their rights. If pushed, they would secede from the Union. At the annual birthday banquet in honor of Thomas Jefferson, an occasion for celebrating states' rights, the first toasts were predictable. But then Robert Hayne toasted the union of the states and the sovereignty of the states. Calhoun shifted in his seat as Jackson rose. With his eyes locked on the chief of the nullifiers, Jackson proclaimed,
"A federal union, it must be preserved."
To which Calhoun responded,
"The Union, next to our liberty most dear."
A few days later, when asked by a congressman from South Carolina if the president had any message to convey to his Carolina friends, Jackson told him,
"If a single drop of blood shall be shed there in opposition to the laws of the United States, I will hang the first man I can lay my hand on, upon the first tree I can reach."
On November 24, 1832, the undeterred Carolina legislature passed an ordinance of nullification by a vote of 136 to 26 and threatened to secede. Jackson promptly ordered all federal forts in South Carolina reinforced and put the Navy on alert. Calhoun resigned as vice president. Jackson then told Carolina's representatives that he was prepared to send 50,000 federalized militia into their state to enforce the Constitution. When the nullifiers let it be known that they might comply with federal law if an adjustment could be made in the tariff, Jackson agreed to a compromise. The tariff was reduced, and South Carolina annulled its ordinance of nullification. The crisis which had brought the nation to the brink had passed. But the conflict between the North and the South, which it had aggravated, would fester for 30 years before exploding into a bloody civil war. But of all the things which Jackson believed threatened the life of the Republic, none loomed larger than the Bank of the United States. The brainchild of Alexander Hamilton, the second bank of the United States was a privately owned quasi-monopoly in which the United States Treasury deposited public funds. The United States was a stockholder in the bank but drew no interest on its deposits. Nicholas Biddle, the bank's aristocratic and dictatorial president, claimed that his bank was every bit the federal government's equal, and he had warned successive administrations not to interfere.
The controversy over banking went back to Hamilton. It went back, in fact, to England. It went back into English history, pre-revolutionary English history. There were many Americans who felt that a central bank was an agency of corruption. It was an association of the federal government with a very narrow economic class, that it hurt all kinds of people all through the society.
With the bank's charter up for renewal and Andrew Jackson up for re-election, Biddle urged Henry Clay, who had just announced his own candidacy, to introduce legislation for rechartering the bank. Jackson vetoed it. The political gauntlet had been thrown. Jackson made the Bank of the United States the issue of his 1832 campaign. His opponents characterized him as a tyrannical usurper of power. But for nearly 55% of the voters, Jackson represented democracy, a proven politician with the interests of the people at heart. Strengthened by his re-election, Jackson renewed his assault on the bank by making his ally, Roger Taney of Maryland, Secretary of the Treasury. Taney announced that the government would no longer deposit its revenues in the Bank of the United States. Biddle countered by squeezing the money supply, raising interest rates, and calling in loans. As deflation set in, panic loomed. As the nation suffered, Biddle pointed to Jackson as the cause of its pain. When hordes of businessmen complained, Jackson turned a deaf ear and told them,
Go to Nicholas Biddle, he has all the money. I will not bow to the golden calf.
Jackson was willing to let the nation suffer deep depression if it wrecked the bank. Biddle was willing to let the economy collapse to save it. The mood of the country grew so violent, Martin Van Buren wore pistols when he presided over the Senate. Jackson himself received hundreds of death threats. Then, on a cold, foggy morning in late January 1835, a disgruntled office seeker fired 2 pistols at Jackson at close range. Both misfired. Jackson's escape was deemed miraculous. As Jackson's health declined, those closest to him felt that the only thing keeping him alive was the fight. Old wounds, especially the bullet in his chest from Charles Dickinson's pistol, brought excruciating pain and repeated hemorrhages. Whenever he felt particularly weak, Jackson would have himself bled, or, alone, he would open his own vein. Finally, pushed to the wall by his former allies, Biddle dramatically expanded the money supply. Jackson was right. Biddle did have the money. The panic was over. For all intents and purposes, the Bank of the United States was dead. Jackson had prevailed. When asked about the greatest achievement of his presidency, Jackson replied, defeat of the bank. When asked if he had any regrets, Jackson had only 2. That he hadn't hung John C. Calhoun, and that he'd never beaten Haney's Mariah, the fastest racehorse in Tennessee.